Alessandro De Luca, the feared Mafia boss of New York, sacrifices everything to dismantle a conspiracy inside his own empire. To lure out the traitors, he stages his own assassination, allowing the entire world, including the woman he loves, to believe he is dead. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Dark Romance Stories channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Rain fell over New York the day they buried Alessandro De Luca, and every umbrella in Woodlawn Cemetery seemed to bow beneath the weight of it, as though the sky itself understood that something enormous had ended. Isabella Romano stood at the edge of the crowd. Apart from the men in black suits who had once feared the name De Luca more than they feared God. She did not weep where they could see her. She had learned, in the 18 months she had known him, that grief shown to the wrong eyes became a weapon in someone else's hand, and she would not hand his enemies that gift, not even now, not even with his casket lowering into the cold earth 6 feet from where she stood. The priest spoke words that meant nothing. Rain slid down the black lacquer of the casket like it was trying to wash away a name that history would not let go so easily. Isabella watched 200 men who had once knelt to kiss Alessandro's ring stand dry-eyed and impatient, already dividing his empire in their minds, already calculating who would sit at the head of which table, now that the king was gone. She was the only one who had loved him without wanting anything from him. That was, perhaps, why it hurt the way it did. A hollowing so total that she wondered whether her body would simply stop remembering how to keep her upright. She had met Alessandro De Luca on a night she still could not think about without her chest caving in. A charity gala on the Upper East Side, chandeliers dripping gold light onto marble floors, and a man in a black suit who did not smile at anyone, who moved through that glittering room like a shadow that had learned to wear a tuxedo. He had found her on the balcony, away from the noise, staring at the East River, because she did not know how to make small talk with people who wore more jewelry than her mother had earned in a lifetime. "You don't belong here," he had said, not cruelly, almost like an observation about himself. "Neither do you," she had answered, before she understood who he was. He had laughed, a low, surprised sound, as if no one had spoken to him so plainly in years. "No," he agreed, "I don't." She had not known that night that the man beside her commanded fear across 5 boroughs, that his name alone could empty a restaurant or fill a hospital wing. She had known only that his eyes carried something heavy, something that made her want to ask what it cost him to carry it. And when he had asked for her number, instead of simply obtaining it, as he could have, as men like him always did, something in her had softened toward him before she had a single reason to trust him. Now she stood in the rain, watching strangers shovel dirt over that same darkness in his eyes, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that she had never gotten the chance to ask him what it cost. "Miss Romano." She turned. Dante Marchetti, Alessandro's oldest friend, and the only man who had wept openly at the wake, stood beside her with an umbrella he did not offer to share. His face was carved from the same grief as hers, though grief for a different reason, the loss of a brother, not a lover. He would not want you standing in the rain, Dante said quietly. He's not here to have an opinion about it, Isabella said, and the words came out sharper than she meant them, sharpened by a pain that had nowhere else to go. Dante's jaw tightened, some private thought moving behind his eyes that she would understand only 2 years later, though in this moment it registered only as sympathy. "No," he said, "I suppose he isn't." She did not know that 3 men in that cemetery were performing grief they did not feel, that Dante Marchetti, Nico Falcone, and an old fixer named Salvatore Greco were the only souls on earth who understood that the casket being lowered into the ground held sandbags and nothing else, that Alessandro De Luca was at that very moment watching his own funeral from behind the tinted glass of a black car parked on the cemetery's outer road, close enough to see her, close enough to see the woman he loved falling apart over a lie he had built with his own hands. He had told himself he could do this. He had told himself that letting the world believe him dead, including her, especially her, was the only way to draw the traitors in his organization out of hiding, the only way to find the men who had poisoned his second-in-command and paid to have his own convoy ambushed on the West Side Highway. He had told himself Isabella's grief would be temporary, a wound that closed once he returned. He had not accounted for what it would do to him to watch her weep and be unable to cross 50 yards of wet grass to hold her. His hand found the window and pressed flat against the cold glass, an instinct with nowhere to go. "Boss?" Nico said quietly from the front seat, not looking back, giving him the privacy of not being watched in this moment. "We should go. Cameras." Alessandro did not answer immediately. He watched Isabella kneel at the edge of the grave, not sobbing, not performing anything for the crowd, just kneeling in mud in a black dress that was ruining in the rain, pressing her palm flat against the wet earth as if she could reach through 6 feet of soil and touch him one last time. 2 years, he said finally, so quietly it was almost to himself. I give myself 2 years to end this, and then I go back to her. And if it takes longer? Nico asked. Alessandro's eyes did not leave the woman kneeling in the rain. Then it takes longer. But I will not let her marry someone else, and I will not let her die not knowing I loved her, whatever it costs. The car pulled away before she could see it. Isabella never knew that day that the last car to leave Woodlawn Cemetery carried the only man who had ever asked what her silences meant, instead of filling them with noise. She only knew that when she finally stood, her knees soaked through, the rain had not stopped, and neither, she suspected, would the ache in her chest. Not in a year, not in 5, not ever. She did not know she was wrong about the timeline. She only knew, with the terrible certainty of new grief, that she would love a dead man for the rest of her life. Because loving him, even now, felt safer than admitting the world could take someone that good and simply erase them. 3 weeks after the funeral, Isabella found the plot of land on her own, a quiet outcrop above the Hudson, in a small, half-forgotten cemetery in Riverdale, nothing like the marble mausoleum where the De Luca family had actually laid an empty casket to rest. She had not been permitted to bury anything there. The family plot belonged to blood, and grief, apparently, did not qualify her for a place among the De Luca dead, whatever Alessandro had felt for her in life. So she built him a different grave. It was a modest headstone, grey granite, no larger than her forearm was long, set into soft earth, overlooking a bend in the river where the water caught the evening light and turned the colour of a bruise healing. She had commissioned it herself, paid for it with money she had saved working as a restorer of old paintings, the profession that had, ironically, been what drew Alessandro to her in the first place, the quiet, careful woman who mended things that had been broken by time. She had the mason carve only his first name and the years of his life. No De Luca, no titles. Nothing that would connect this quiet hill to the empire that had swallowed him. This grave was not for the world. It was for her. The first Sunday she brought white lilies, because he had once told her, on their third date, sitting in a dim Italian restaurant in the West Village, with candlelight throwing shadows across the sharp planes of his face, that his mother had grown lilies in Sicily before she died, and that the smell of them still, 20 years later, made something in his chest unclench. "You don't talk about her," Isabella had said. "I don't talk about anything that could be used against me," he had answered, and then, after a long pause, watching her face carefully as if deciding something, "But I would tell you. If you asked me anything, I think you're the only person I would tell the truth to." She had not understood then how rare a gift that was, a dangerous man handing a woman the only unguarded thing he owned. She understood it now, kneeling at a grave that held no body, laying white lilies against cold granite, with hands that had gone numb from more than the autumn cold. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, to no one, to the river, to the granite, to the ghost of a man who had once traced the line of her jaw like he was memorizing something he expected to lose. "But I'm going to keep coming here, every Sunday, because somebody should remember you as a person and not as a headline." The newspapers, in the weeks since his death, had run stories with names like "The Fall of the De Luca Empire" and "Mafia Kingpin Gunned Down in Gang War." None of them mentioned that he had once sat with her for 4 hours in a hospital waiting room when her father had a heart scare, not saying much, just being a wall of quiet solidity beside her, because he understood, better than anyone, what it felt like to be afraid of losing a parent. None of them mentioned that he read poetry when he thought no one was looking, or that he had learned, clumsily, badly, adorably, how to cook her grandmother's osso buco recipe, because she'd mentioned once that she missed it. None of them mentioned that he had loved her the way a starving man loves bread, like something he did not deserve and could not stop reaching for anyway. "I kept the ring," she told the grave, twisting the small gold band he had given her, not as an engagement, but as what he'd called a promise before I earn the right to ask you properly. She had thought at the time that it was strange phrasing from a man who took what he wanted without asking. Now she understood it had been the truest thing he'd ever said to her, that some part of him had known, even then, that he was not yet free enough of his world to offer her a real future, and that he intended some day to become a man who could. She did not know that 400 yards away, parked on a service road that overlooked the same bend of river, a man in a grey sedan watched her through a long lens, not to surveil her, not for any purpose, but the unbearable, addictive need to see her face, the way grief had carved new lines beside her eyes, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. Nico Falcone sat behind the wheel, arms crossed, watching his boss with the same worry he might have shown a man standing too close to a ledge. "This isn't part of the plan," he said. "You said watch the funeral, confirm she's safe, and that's it." "I said I would end this in 2 years," Alessandro answered, lowering the lens but not his eyes. "I didn't say I would stay away." "Every time you come here, you risk everything." "I know." "Then why?" "Because," Alessandro said, and something in his voice made Nico go quiet, a rawness that the boss never allowed anyone to hear. "She thinks I'm dead, Nico. She is grieving a man who is sitting 50 feet away, alive, watching her fall apart, and unable to do a single thing about it. If I don't come, if I don't at least witness what my choice is costing her, then I am not a man who loves her. I am only a man who used her grief as a smokescreen, and I refuse to become that." Nico said nothing more. He started the engine when Isabella finally rose from her knees, brushed the mud from her dress, and walked back toward the road where her car was parked, alone, the way she would walk away from that grave every Sunday for the next 2 years, never once looking back to see the sedan idling on the service road, never once suspecting that the man she mourned was close enough, some weeks, to hear the sound of her voice carried on the wind. The building on the east side that housed Alessandro's rebuilt life had no name on the buzzer and no record in any registry that mattered. Officially, Alessandro De Luca was dead, his assets frozen, distributed or seized by a justice department that had spent a decade trying to bring him down, and had on paper finally succeeded, through means they did not understand and were not eager to investigate too closely. Unofficially, 3 men, Dante Marchetti, Nico Falcone, and Salvatore Greco, moved money through shell companies with names like Size, kept a penthouse dark and unregistered 11 floors above a shuttered textile warehouse in Long Island City, and reported each week to a man the world believed was ash and bone in Woodlawn Cemetery. "Give me the list again," Alessandro said, standing at the window of that dark penthouse, looking out over a city that no longer knew his name. He wore no jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and in the 2 years since his staged death he had leaned harder into a kind of monastic severity, no cologne that might be recognized, hair cut shorter and greyed prematurely at the temples by a stress that would have killed most men, a face that had learned new lines of its own. Dante spread a folder across the steel table behind him. "Vittorio Conti, head of the Conti family, was making moves against you for 18 months before the ambush. Motive, means, and the poison used on Marco traces back to a supplier Conti's people have used before." Continue. "Renata Salvi, your father's old consigliere, never forgave you for pushing the family away from the heroin trade 6 years ago. Lost income, lost face." "And the third?" Dante hesitated, the way he always hesitated at this part of the briefing, because the third name was the one that made Alessandro's jaw lock every time it was spoken. "Someone inside your own circle. The ambush knew your route 4 minutes before you changed it. Only 6 people had that information. We've cleared 4. The remaining 2. Salvatore," Dante said, and swallowed, because Salvatore Greco stood in the room with them, arms crossed, unreadable as stone. and me. Alessandro turned from the window, his eyes, dark and flat as they had been trained to be for 30 years, moved between the two men who had given up their entire lives to help him fake his death, men who had lied to their own families, disappeared from their own lives, forfeited 2 years of freedom to sit in this dark room and hunt ghosts with him.
"I know it isn't either of you," he said finally. "I have known that since the beginning. But I need you both to understand why I still have to ask. If I let sentiment blind me to even one possibility, I become exactly the kind of fool who dies in an ambush a second time." Salvatore's mouth curved, the closest thing to warmth the old fixer's face ever produced. "Good. If you'd trusted us blindly, I would have worried you'd lost your edge." "I haven't lost anything," Alessandro said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for the two men in the room to hear it and pretend they hadn't. "Except 2 years of my life. Except the right to sit across a table from the woman I love and tell her the truth." He crossed to the table, picked up a photograph clipped to the folder, surveillance taken the previous Sunday, of Isabella kneeling at the grave by the river, a windbreaker pulled tight against October cold, her dark hair whipping across a face that had thinned in a way that made something violent twist in his chest. "She stopped eating properly," he said. It wasn't a question. "Marco's contact at the restoration studio says she's lost 15 pounds since the funeral," Dante confirmed quietly. "She still works, still delivers on time, but she doesn't go out anymore, doesn't see friends, goes to the grave every Sunday and comes home, and that's the whole of her week." Alessandro set the photograph down with a care that suggested he was afraid of damaging it, though it was only paper. "How much longer, Dante? Tell me honestly, how much longer until we can move on Conti and Salvi without exposing every man we've turned, every account we've traced?" Dante exchanged a look with Salvatore before answering. 6 months. Maybe less if the Conti financials keep bleeding the way they have been. He's been making risky plays lately, expanding into territory that isn't his, buying loyalty he can't really afford. If we let him keep hemorrhaging money for another 2 quarters, half his own capos will turn on him without us lifting a finger. 6 months, Alessandro repeated. He looked back out the window, toward the invisible curve of the Hudson somewhere beyond the skyline, toward a hill he had visited 11 times in 2 years, always from a distance, always leaving before she could turn and see a man who was supposed to be dead. "She has waited 2 years for a grave. I am asking her, without her knowledge, to wait 6 more months for a resurrection. I don't know which is crueler." "The alternative is worse," Salvatore said bluntly. "You go to her now, before the traitors inside your own organization are found, and you paint a target on her back the size of Manhattan. Conti already suspects you might not be as dead as advertised. Why else would he still be moving cautiously instead of consolidating outright? If he learns you're alive before we've closed every door, he goes after the only leverage he has left. Her." Alessandro's hand curled into a fist against the cold glass of the window. "Then we close the doors faster." "Boss, I said faster, Dante." His voice had gone quiet in the way that had once made grown men in his organization go pale. Not loud, not a shout, just a stillness underneath the words that promised something absolute. "I have watched that woman grieve me for 2 years. I have watched her build a grave with her own hands and kneel in front of it in the rain, in the snow, in 90-degree heat, because she believes loyalty to a dead man matters more than her own happiness. I will not ask her to wait a single day longer than necessary. Find me a way to move faster, or I will find one myself, and you will not like the risks I take without your input. The room went silent, except for the low hum of the city outside, indifferent to all of it, the way cities always were to the private wars fought inside their glass towers. "There might be a way," Dante said slowly, after a long moment, "but you're not going to like it either. Tell me anyway." "Marchetti," Salvatore warned. "Tell me," Alessandro said again, and this time it was not a request. Vittorio Conti's son had his father's ambition and none of his patience, which was, Alessandro would later think, the single most dangerous combination a man in their world could possess. Matteo Conti was 31 years old, educated at Georgetown, groomed for a legitimate life his father had never wanted for him, and then pulled back into the family business the moment Vittorio realized his empire needed a face the FBI hadn't already built a file on. He was handsome in the practiced, gym-sculpted way of a man who had always been told he was destined for something. Charming in the way of men who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. And hungry, desperately, gnawingly hungry, for a kind of power his father's cautious, calculating reign had never quite delivered. He had first seen Isabella Romano 8 months after Alessandro's funeral, at a charity auction for a hospital wing the Conti family funded as a laundering operation dressed up in black tie clothing. She had been there, restoring a damaged fresco panel the hospital was auctioning, standing quietly near the piece she'd spent 3 months repairing, dressed simply in navy instead of the sequined excess around her. And Matteo had watched her the way a man watches something he has decided, on no evidence at all, belongs to him. "Who is she?" he'd asked his father's second, not really a question. "Isabella Romano, art restorer. She was involved with De Luca before he died." Matteo had smiled, slow and satisfied, the smile of a man who had just found the answer to a problem he hadn't known he had. Even better. It took him 14 months of careful, patient cultivation, flowers she never asked for, invitations to galleries she attended only because her work required it, a persistence dressed up as gentlemanly interest, before he understood that Isabella Romano would never want him for himself, and that the only leverage strong enough to move her was leverage he was more than willing to use. Isabella's father, Salvatore Romano, had never been part of the underworld his daughter had briefly touched, but he owed money, old money, foolish money, borrowed against a small restaurant in Bensonhurst that had been failing for years before Alessandro's death and had failed entirely in the 2 years since, as if the restaurant itself had absorbed some of her grief. Matteo Conti's family owned that debt now, purchased quietly from the original lender at a steep discount, the kind of transaction that meant nothing to men who moved millions, and everything to a man whose life savings sat in a restaurant with peeling paint. The offer, when Matteo finally made it, was dressed in silk and delivered with a smile. "Marry me," he told Isabella, in her father's restaurant, over coffee her father had insisted on serving personally, because he did not yet know the true shape of the noose closing around his daughter's throat. "And your father's debt disappears. The restaurant stays open. He keeps his dignity. You keep your family. All I'm asking in return is a wife who understands what our world requires." "And if I say no?" Isabella had asked, very quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she was not drinking from. Matteo's smile had not wavered, but something colder moved behind his eyes, the family resemblance to his father surfacing at last. "Then the loan comes due in full, in 30 days, and your father loses everything he's spent 30 years building." "I don't want it to be that way, Isabella.
I would much rather you choose me because you want to. But I've learned that some women need additional motivation." She had not answered him that day. She had gone home and sat at her small kitchen table and stared at nothing for 3 hours. And then, because it was Sunday, she had gone to the grave by the river, kneeling in front of the granite stone in a light rain, her hands pressed flat against the cold surface. "I don't know what to do," she told him, the way she told him everything now. The dead man who had become her only confidant, the only one she trusted with the true shape of her fear. "My father worked his whole life for that restaurant. And Matteo, he isn't cruel exactly, he wants what he wants, and he doesn't understand why the world shouldn't simply hand it to him. He reminds me of the men who used to come around you before, the kind who mistake power for love." She laughed, a broken, humourless sound. "You never did that. You had all the power in the world, and you never once used it on me. You asked. Do you know how rare that was? How rare that still is?" 50 yards away, hidden by a stand of bare October trees, Alessandro De Luca stood in a long coat with his collar turned up, and for the first time in 2 years the careful monastic control he had built around himself since his staged death began, visibly, audibly, to crack. His hands in his coat pockets had curled into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. He had known from Dante's reports that Matteo Conti was circling her. He had known about the debt, about the restaurant, about the slow, patient siege being laid against the only person he had left in the world worth protecting. What he had not known, what no report could have prepared him for, was what it would feel like to stand in the cold and listen to the woman he loved describe another man's courtship in the same breath she used to describe her grief for him. To hear the exhaustion in her voice, the resignation of a woman who had already, quietly, begun to accept that she might have to marry a stranger to save her father. "I won't let this happen," he said, so quietly that only the wind heard him, and even the wind seemed to carry the words toward the river rather than toward her, as if the universe itself understood that the time for him to speak had not yet come, however much every cell in his body screamed that it had. He turned and walked back toward the car where Nico waited, and his voice, when he spoke, held none of the careful calm he had maintained through 2 years of exile. "Move up the timeline," he said. "I don't care what it costs us. I want Conti's financials in my hands within the month, and I want to know everything about this engagement plan before Matteo Conti puts a ring on a hand that already wears mine." Isabella said yes to Matteo Conti on a Tuesday in November, in a lawyer's office with cold, fluorescent lighting that made everyone in the room look slightly embalmed, and she said it the way a woman signs a form she has not read, because the alternative, her father losing everything he had built, with hands that now shook too much to work a stove, was unthinkable. Her father, Salvatore Romano, wept when she told him, though not with relief. "I never wanted this for you," he said,
his accent thickening the way it always did when emotion overtook him. 30 years in America, unable to fully erase the Palermo of his childhood. I would rather lose the restaurant. I would rather lose everything than watch you sell yourself to save an old man's pride. You're not an old man's pride, Isabella said, taking his weathered hands in hers, hands that had rolled dough and counted receipts and, once, held her as a child through a thunderstorm that had terrified her. You're my father, and this restaurant is the only piece of Mama we have left. Her mother had died when Isabella was 19, and the restaurant, a small, unglamorous place with red checked tablecloths and a menu that hadn't changed in 2 decades, had been her mother's dream before it was her father's burden. Isabella had grown up in its kitchen, learning recipes at her mother's elbow, and some part of her had never stopped believing that as long as the restaurant's lights stayed on, some fragment of her mother remained in the world. Alessandro would never have asked this of me, she said quietly, and it was the first time she had spoken his name aloud to her father since the funeral. He never once asked me to be less than I was. Do you know how strange that felt, Papa? A man like that, and he never once made me feel small. Salvatore studied his daughter's face, seeing in it the particular grief of a woman who had loved someone whose absence had become the shape of her entire life. Then why does this Conti boy get to demand what De Luca never did? Because Alessandro is dead, Isabella said, and I have run out of miracles. She did not cry in front of her father. She saved that for the drive home, alone in her car, pulled over on the shoulder of the Belt Parkway, with her hazards blinking uselessly into the dark, sobbing in a way she had not allowed herself since the first month of her grief, when Dante Marchetti had once found her collapsed on the floor of her apartment and had sat with her in silence for 6 hours, because there was nothing else to be done. She did not know that Dante had reported that night in detail to a man watching from a rooftop 3 blocks from her building, and that the man had not slept for 2 days afterward, haunted by an image relayed second-hand of the woman he loved curled on hardwood floors like something broken beyond repair. She did not know, now, pulled over on the shoulder of a highway with her hazards blinking, that a black sedan had slowed a 1/4 mile behind her and idled there for 11 minutes before continuing on, because the man inside it could not make himself drive past her pain without at least confirming with his own eyes that she was breathing. The engagement was announced the following week, a small item in the society pages. Isabella Romano, art restorer, to wed Matteo Conti, heir to Conti Enterprises, with a photograph of the 2 of them at a gallery opening, Matteo's hand resting possessively at the small of her back, Isabella's smile, the practiced, careful smile of a woman performing happiness for a camera. Alessandro read the item, standing at his window in the dark penthouse, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and Dante and Nico, watching him, understood that his silence in that moment was more dangerous than any shout could have been. "We move now," Alessandro said finally. "The Conti financials aren't fully mapped yet," Dante said carefully. "We need 3 more weeks to trace the last of his shell accounts, to confirm which capos are ready to turn on him once he's exposed." "I don't care about 3 weeks from now," Alessandro said, and his voice had gone to a place none of them had heard it go in 2 years. Not cold, not controlled, but raw, ragged. A voice that belonged to a man rather than a legend. "I care about the fact that in 6 weeks that woman is going to stand in a church and marry a man who bought her like a piece of property. And I'm going to have let it happen because I was too careful, too patient, too concerned with perfecting a plan instead of protecting the only person I have ever loved. "If you move before we're ready," Salvatore said, his voice steady in the way it always was, the voice of a man who had buried more friends than most men had made in a lifetime. "You don't just risk yourself, you risk her. Conti finds out you're alive, he doesn't hesitate. He uses her as a shield, or worse, he decides she's more valuable dead than as leverage against you. You want to save her from a wedding. Don't trade that for putting a bullet in her instead." The words landed like a physical blow. Alessandro closed his eyes, and for a moment the mask he had worn for 2 years, the mask of a man who had made peace with sacrifice, slipped entirely, revealing underneath it something closer to despair. "Then tell me what to do," he said quietly, "because I am done watching from a distance while she disappears in front of me." Dante and Salvatore exchanged a long look, the look of 2 men who had spent 2 years managing a leader's grief alongside his war, and who understood, finally, that the war and the grief could no longer be separated. "There's a wedding date," Dante said slowly. 6 weeks out. That gives us 6 weeks to finish mapping Conti's finances, 6 weeks to identify the last traitor in our own ranks, 6 weeks to build a case airtight enough that when you walk back into the world, you walk back in as a man who can protect her, not one who's still hiding. "And if 6 weeks isn't enough?" Dante's jaw tightened. "Then you go to that wedding, boss, and you stop it in front of everyone, whether we're ready or not. Because I know you. I've known you since we were boys, running errands for your father in Bensonhurst. And I know that no strategy, no plan, no amount of caution is going to keep you in the shadows while she says, 'I do,' to another man. So let's use these 6 weeks to make sure that when you finally step out of the dark, you're stepping into something you can survive." Alessandro looked out at the city again, at the lights strung along a skyline that had no idea a war was quietly reaching its final act, somewhere beneath its glittering surface. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, and then I go back to her, ready or not. The engagement did not stop Isabella's Sunday visits to the grave. If anything, they became more essential, the 1 hour of her week that belonged entirely to grief instead of obligation, the one place where she did not have to perform gratitude for a fiancé who had purchased her with her father's debt. Matteo did not understand the grave, and had made it clear early in their engagement that he found the habit distasteful. "You're marrying me in 6 weeks, he'd said, the first and only time he'd raised the subject, sitting across from her in a restaurant so expensive the menu didn't list prices. It's a strange way to start a marriage, mourning another man every Sunday, like it's a religious obligation. It's not a strange way to grieve, Isabella had answered, meeting his eyes without flinching, a small act of defiance that was, in truth, all she had left to give. I would think a man in your world would understand loss better than most. I understand it fine, Matteo had said, something flickering behind his charming smile, a flash of the same possessiveness that ran in his family's blood like a genetic marker. I understand it well enough to know that once we're married, that grave doesn't get visited any more. I won't have my wife spending her Sundays pining for a dead man while wearing my ring. Then perhaps you shouldn't have bought a wife who has a dead man's ring already on her finger, Isabella had said, and the silence that followed had been sharp enough to cut. though Matteo had eventually laughed it off, the way he laughed off everything that didn't fit the story he told himself about their engagement, a story where she would, eventually, come to love him the way she'd loved Alessandro De Luca, simply because proximity and time demanded it. She had not stopped wearing the ring Alessandro had given her, the small gold band he had called a promise. She wore it on her right hand now, since the engagement ring Matteo had given her, an obscene, glittering thing that felt like a manacle every time it caught the light, occupied her left. 2 rings, 2 men, 2 entirely different kinds of ownership, though only one of them had ever felt like love instead of acquisition. On the Sunday 6 weeks before her wedding, the rain came down in sheets thick enough to blur the river into the colour of wet slate, and Isabella knelt at the grave anyway, because she had promised herself, in the raw agony of that first month of grief, that nothing, not weather, not exhaustion, not the slow crushing weight of an engagement she had not chosen, would keep her from this 1 hour. "I'm getting married in 6 weeks," she told the headstone, water running down her face in rivulets that made it impossible to tell where rain ended and tears began. "To a man who thinks love is the same thing as ownership. I keep thinking about how different you were, how you never once tried to own me. You just asked. Every time, like my answer actually mattered to you." She laughed, a broken sound swallowed almost immediately by the rain. "I used to think that was strange for a man like you. Now I think it was the rarest thing about you, the thing I'll never find again." She did not know that 40 yards away, sheltered beneath the dripping canopy of an ancient oak, a man stood with his collar turned up against the rain, listening to every word, his own face wet with something the storm alone could not account for. Alessandro had told himself, driving here, that this would be the last time, that once the wedding date had been announced, once the countdown had become real and finite, he owed it to his own discipline to stop coming, to let the reports from Dante and Nico be enough. He had told himself this every Sunday for the past month, and every Sunday he had found himself here anyway, drawn by a gravitational pull stronger than any strategic calculation. 6 weeks, he murmured to himself, watching her rise from her knees, watching her press one hand briefly against the wet granite before turning to leave. The particular slump of her shoulders, a woman carrying weight she had long since stopped believing she could set down. "You're not going to make it 6 weeks, are you?" Nico said quietly, from where he stood a few paces back, having long since stopped trying to talk his boss out of these visits. "No," Alessandro admitted, "I don't think I am." Dante said, "I know what Dante said." Alessandro's eyes did not leave Isabella's retreating figure, the black umbrella she'd finally opened too late to do any good, her hair plastered to her face, her steps unhurried despite the storm, as if some part of her had stopped believing weather or anything else could touch her any more. "But I am done letting other men's timelines dictate how much of her suffering I'm willing to witness before I act. Get Dante on the phone. I want a full report on where we stand with Conti's finances, and I want it tonight." "And if we're not ready?" Alessandro finally turned from the sight of her disappearing into the grey curtain of rain, and something in his face had hardened into a decision Nico recognized from years of watching this man make the impossible choices that had built and nearly destroyed an empire. "Then we get ready faster," Alessandro said,
Because I have watched that woman grieve me in every season for 2 years, and I will not add a wedding to the list of things she survives without me. Vittorio Conti had not survived 30 years at the head of one of New York's 5 ruling families by being careless, but ambition, his son's ambition specifically, had begun to open cracks in an empire that had once seemed unbreakable. Matteo's push to acquire Bensonhurst territory that traditionally belonged to smaller, independent operators had ruffled feathers among capos who valued the old codes, the old boundaries, the old, careful diplomacy that had kept the 5 families from open war for 2 decades. His engagement to Isabella Romano, clearly a manoeuvre, however dressed up in romantic language, to claim a piece of the mystique that had once surrounded Alessandro de Luca, had struck several old guard members of the Conti organization as disrespectful to a dead man's memory. A superstition more than a political calculation, but one that mattered in a world built on symbolism and honor as much as on money. Dante Marchetti had spent 6 weeks cultivating exactly this discontent. Emilio Bassano, Dante reported, standing in the dark penthouse with a laptop open to a spreadsheet of numbers that told a story more damning than any confession. Conti's underboss for the past 12 years. He's been quietly moving money out of accounts tied to the family for the last 4 months. Nothing dramatic, small enough not to trigger alarm bells, but consistent. A man doesn't do that unless he's preparing to leave, or preparing to be blamed for something he didn't do, or preparing to betray the man he serves, Alessandro said. Exactly. And there's more. Dante turned the laptop toward him. Bassano's been in contact with a woman named Renata Salvi, your father's old consigliere, the same Salvi who's been on our suspect list since day 1. Alessandro's eyes moved across the numbers, the pattern of wire transfers and shell accounts, assembling itself into a shape he had begun slowly to recognize. Not a single conspiracy, but a web of overlapping ambitions, each player believing they controlled the strings, while in fact no single hand held the whole design. Salvi wants revenge for being pushed out of the heroin trade, he said slowly. Conti wants my territory and my mystique, wants to absorb what's left of my empire into his own by marrying into whatever legitimacy Isabella represents. And Bassano wants out before whatever's coming crushes him along with his boss. 3 separate motives, 3 separate weaknesses. Which means 3 separate ways to break them, Salvatore said, entering the room with a folder of his own, his weathered face carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how empires crumbled. Bassano's greed makes him vulnerable to a better offer. Salvi's grudge makes her vulnerable to being convinced her enemies are closer than she thinks. And Conti's ambition makes him vulnerable to overreaching in front of witnesses who'll remember it. Explain, Alessandro said. Salvatore spread the folder across the table. Photographs, financial records, a timeline stretching back 4 years. Conti has been telling his own capos that the ambush on your convoy 2 years ago was carried out by a rival family, not by his own hand. He's built his entire rise on the story that he simply capitalized on your death rather than caused it. If we can prove, in front of the people whose loyalty he depends on, that he orchestrated the ambush himself, that he poisoned Marco Silvestri to get close enough to your operation to plan it, his own organization turns on him before we ever have to lift a gun. You have proof. I have circumstantial evidence,
strong enough to plant doubt. I need one more piece to make it undeniable.
Salvatore's eyes met Alessandro's, and something passed between them. The particular understanding of two men who had spent their lives in a world where the difference between suspicion and proof could mean the difference between life and death. I need Bassano to talk, and Bassano won't talk to us. He'll only talk to someone he still believes is dead, someone whose ghost might finally offer him a way out of a war he never wanted to fight. The room went quiet. You want me to reveal myself to Bassano, Alessandro said, before the timeline we agreed on. I want you to reveal yourself to exactly one man, in exactly one room, under conditions we control completely, Salvatore said. Not to the world, not to Conti, not yet. But Bassano is the linchpin, Alessandro. He knows things Conti doesn't know we know. He can give us the ambush order in Conti's own handwriting, the wire transfer that paid for Marco's poison, the proof that turns Conti's own family against him before your wedding, before Isabella's wedding, ever takes place. Alessandro looked at the photograph on top of the folder. Isabella at a fitting. A photograph clearly taken without her knowledge, her face arranged into the careful blankness of a woman going through motions she had already emotionally abandoned. Set the meeting, he said. Whatever it takes, however dangerous. I have spent 2 years being patient. I am done being patient with anything except getting this exactly right. Emilio Bassano had not slept well in 4 months, not since the night he'd finally allowed himself to admit that Vittorio Conti's ambush of Alessandro De Luca, an operation Bassano himself had helped plan back when loyalty to Conti had seemed like the safer bet in a shifting world, had been built on a lie that was going to collapse and take everyone associated with it down, along with the truth. He had not expected, on a rain-slicked Tuesday night, to be pulled off a quiet street in Astoria by 2 men in an unmarked car, hooded, and driven for 40 minutes to a location he did not recognize. He had not expected, when the hood came off, to find himself sitting across a steel table from a dead man. "You're seeing things," Bassano said, his voice cracking despite 30 years of careful performance, of never showing fear, even when fear was the only rational response. "De Luca's dead. I watched them lower the casket myself." "You watched them lower an empty casket," Alessandro said, his voice carrying the particular stillness that had once made men twice Bassano's size go quiet in rooms far less frightening than this one. "Which you would know, Emilio, if you were the one who ordered the ambush that was supposed to fill it. But you weren't, were you? Vittorio gave that order. You just helped him execute it, because a smart underboss doesn't say no to his boss's ambitions, even when he suspects those ambitions are built on sand." Bassano's hands cuffed loosely to the arms of the chair, a precaution, not a threat, Alessandro had insisted, because he needed this man's cooperation, not his terror, began to shake. "I don't know what you think you know. I know that 4 months ago you started moving money out of accounts tied to the Conti family," Alessandro said, sliding a folder across the table, watching Bassano's face pale as he recognized his own financial records staring back at him. "I know that a man doesn't do that unless he's preparing for the walls to come down around him. I know that you've spent 30 years building a life you don't want to lose because Vittorio Conti's son decided he wanted a dead man's mystique
badly enough to marry a woman he's using as a trophy. "You know about the girl," Bassano said quietly, something shifting in his expression. Not fear now, but a kind of tired recognition, the look of a man who had spent decades in a business built on brutality and had, somewhere along the way, developed the capacity to be disgusted by it. "I know everything," Alessandro said, though it was not entirely true. He knew enough, and the gaps he did not know he intended for Bassano to fill. Bassano was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the folder, the man he had believed dead for 2 years, and some middle distance where, perhaps, he was calculating exactly how many ways this conversation could end badly for him. "Vittorio ordered the ambush," he said finally, the words coming out like something long buried, finally breaking the surface. 18 months of planning. He paid a chemist out of Newark for the compound that went into Marco Silvestri's drink, slow enough not to be immediately traced, fast enough to open a hole in your security detail at exactly the right moment. I helped coordinate the logistics because I believed, God help me, that the families needed new leadership, that you'd grown too cautious, too slow to expand, and that Vittorio, at least, had ambition enough to grow what you'd built instead of just protecting it. And now? Bassano's laugh was hollow, bitter. Now I watch his son buy a grieving woman like she's a piece of real estate, watch Vittorio expand into territory that isn't his, and make enemies of capos who'd bled for this family for 20 years. And I realize, too late, the way men like me always realize things too late, that ambition without honor is just theft with better public relations. "I need the order," Alessandro said quietly, "in writing, in Vittorio's hand, or a recording, or anything that will move beyond your word against his. I need proof that will turn his own capos against him before he can consolidate power through a marriage that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with erasing what's left of me." "And what do I get?" Bassano said, some of his old, careful calculation returning to his voice. "For handing you the rope to hang the man I've served for 12 years? You get to live," Alessandro said simply. "You get amnesty from me, guaranteed, the moment my organization is fully restored, which I promise you, Emilio, it will be, sooner than Vittorio Conti currently believes possible. Or you can walk out of this room, go back to your life, and wait for the day Vittorio decides an underboss who's been quietly moving money is a liability he can no longer afford. We both know which of those outcomes you were already losing sleep over." Bassano was silent for a long time, the rain outside the warehouse's boarded windows the only sound in the room. Finally, he nodded, once, the small motion of a man crossing a line he could not uncross. "I have a recording," he said. "Vittorio, discussing the ambush with the chemist, 6 weeks before it happened. I kept it as insurance, in case he ever decided I knew too much to be trusted. I never thought I'd be handing it to a ghost." "I'm not a ghost," Alessandro said, rising from the table, something in his face settling into a certainty that had been building for 2 years and had finally, in this dim warehouse room, found its footing. "I am a man who is about to become very, very alive, Emilio, and I suggest you find somewhere quiet to disappear to until that happens. Because when Vittorio Conti learns what's coming for him, he is not going to go down without trying to take everyone connected to his downfall with him." 4 weeks before her wedding, Isabella stood in a bridal salon on Madison Avenue while a seamstress pinned white silk around her waist, and she felt for the first time in 2 years something close to physically ill. The dress was beautiful, obscenely so, the kind of gown that cost more than her father's restaurant made in a year, chosen not by her, but by Matteo's mother, a sharp-eyed woman named Contessa Conti, who had opinions about everything from the placement of the ceremony to the precise shade of white that would photograph best against Isabella's olive skin.
"You'll want to smile more at the ceremony," Contessa said, studying her future daughter-in-law with the assessing eye of a woman evaluating livestock. "The photographs from your engagement announcement made you look like you were attending a funeral instead of celebrating a betrothal." "I apologize," Isabella said flatly, "if I don't yet have the enthusiasm for a wedding I didn't choose to have." Contessa's eyes narrowed, though her smile did not slip. "You'll learn to want what's good for you, dear. Matteo's father did the same for me 40 years ago. I wept for a month before our wedding. Now I run half his household and most of his social calendar, and I assure you there are far worse fates for a woman than marrying into power." "There are also better ones," Isabella said quietly, and turned back to the mirror before Contessa could respond, staring at her own reflection in a gown white as bone, feeling like a woman watching someone else's life happen to her body. She thought, standing there, of the only other time she had tried on a wedding dress, a private, silly afternoon, 18 months into her relationship with Alessandro, when a friend getting married had dragged her along to a fitting and, laughing, insisted Isabella try on a sample gown, just for fun. She had sent Alessandro a photo, feeling foolish, expecting him to laugh it off or ignore it entirely. A man like him, surely too busy for something so trivial. He had called her within 4 minutes. "Take that off," he'd said, and she'd heard something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not anger, but a kind of raw, unguarded want that had made her breath catch. "Why? Don't you like it?" "I like it too much," he'd said, and there had been a long pause on the line, the sound of him breathing, of some internal struggle she couldn't see. "The first time you wear a dress like that, Isabella, I want it to be for me. I want to be the one standing at the end of that aisle. I don't want to share even the idea of you in white with anyone else's memory of what that moment could have been." "Is that a proposal, Mr. De Luca?" she had teased, though her heart had been hammering. "Not yet," he'd said, quiet and certain. "But it will be. When I've built you a life worth stepping into that dress for. I promise you that." He had never gotten the chance, and now she stood in a different white dress, chosen by a different family, for a wedding to a man whose voice had never once carried that particular unguarded ache. And the unfairness of it sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow or spit out. "Miss Romano." The seamstress's assistant appeared at the doorway, apologetic. "There's a courier here. Says it's urgent, for you specifically." Isabella, grateful for any excuse to leave the fitting room, stepped out in her robe to find a young man in a nondescript uniform holding a small white box tied with simple twine. No card visible, no return address, nothing to indicate who had sent it. "Who's this from?" she asked. "Paid in cash, ma'am. The man said to tell you." The courier checked a small note in his hand, reading with the careful precision of someone repeating words he didn't fully understand. "He said to tell you, for the woman who deserves to choose her own dress."
Isabella's hands went still on the box. She did not open it in front of Contessa Conti's assistant, or the seamstress, or anyone else who might report the moment back to a family that had eyes everywhere. She waited until she was home that evening, alone in her apartment, before she untied the twine with careful, trembling fingers. Inside the box was a single white lily, preserved somehow, its petals still soft, despite whatever process had kept it from wilting, resting atop a small, folded note. She unfolded it with hands that had begun, inexplicably, to shake. The note contained only 4 words, written in a hand she did not recognize, but that sent something electric and impossible up her spine anyway. "Wait for me, please." She sat with that note for an hour, turning it over and over, telling herself it was nothing, a strange gift from a stranger, perhaps even a threat dressed up as romance, the kind of thing Matteo's family might send to unsettle her into greater compliance. She told herself the handwriting meant nothing, that grief made minds see patterns where none existed, that dead men did not send couriers with lilies and cryptic pleas. But she did not throw the note away. She placed it inside the small wooden box where she kept the gold ring Alessandro had given her, the only 2 objects in her apartment that felt, somehow, sacred. And she lay awake that night with her heart racing in a way it had not raced since before a funeral had taught her that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She did not sleep at all. She spent the night at her window, staring down at a quiet Brooklyn street, watching for a shadow that never appeared, though somewhere, 3 blocks away, a man sat in a parked car, with his forehead pressed against the steering wheel, furious with himself for a risk he had taken against every rule Salvatore and Dante had begged him to observe, and unable, entirely, to regret it. Matteo Conti learned about the courier 3 days later, from a source inside the bridal salon he paid handsomely to report on his fiancée's activities, and the information settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he did not like at all. "A lily," he said to his father, standing in Vittorio Conti's office, a room panelled in dark wood and lined with the kind of art that existed to project wealth rather than to be loved. And a note, "Wait for me," sent by courier, paid in cash, no name attached. Vittorio, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived 4 decades of a business built on violence, set down the newspaper he'd been reading with deliberate care. "You think De Luca's men are behind it, some kind of psychological game to unsettle her before the wedding." "I think," Matteo said slowly, "that whoever sent it wanted her to believe it came from him. Which means either someone in his old organization is trying to sabotage the marriage out of misplaced loyalty, or—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, because finishing it meant giving voice to a suspicion that had lived, unspoken, in the back of his mind for 2 years, a suspicion he had never taken seriously enough to investigate, because taking it seriously meant admitting that his entire courtship of Isabella Romano had been built on the assumption of a dead man's absence. "Or he's not as dead as we've all been led to believe," Vittorio finished for him, his voice carrying none of his son's alarm, only the flat calculation of a man who had, in fact, entertained the same suspicion for far longer than his son suspected. "You don't seem surprised," Matteo said carefully. Vittorio's silence stretched a beat too long before he answered. "I've had my doubts since the funeral. De Luca's body was never released for independent examination. His organization insisted on a closed casket, private burial, no coroner's photographs released to the press. At the time, I told myself grief explained it, the family wanting privacy. But grief doesn't usually come with the kind of airtight legal maneuvering that kept every question about his death from ever reaching a courtroom. "If he's alive," Matteo said, and his voice had begun to carry the particular edge of a man realizing his entire plan might be built on a foundation of sand. "Then everything we've built for the past 2 years, the territory expansion, the engagement, all of it, is a house of cards resting on the assumption that a very dangerous man is content to stay dead," Vittorio said. He rose from his desk, moving to the window with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man carrying more weight than his body alone. "Which means we need to find out, definitively, whether Alessandro De Luca is breathing, before your wedding. Before we've committed so fully to this marriage that his return would humiliate this family beyond repair." "How do we find out?" Vittorio's eyes, when he turned back to his son, carried a coldness that reminded Matteo, in that moment, exactly why his father had survived 30 years at the top of a business that devoured weaker men. "We tighten security around Isabella Romano, not to protect her, to trap whoever's been sending her gifts. If it's De Luca himself, sooner or later his obsession with that woman will make him careless enough to be seen. And if he shows himself before the wedding, Matteo, we will not treat his resurrection as a miracle to be celebrated. We will treat it as the single greatest threat this family has faced in a generation, and we will deal with it accordingly." "You're talking about killing him," Matteo said, some of his earlier bravado thinning into something more uncertain. "If he really is alive, De Luca isn't a man you simply kill quietly. He built an empire out of nothing. He has more contacts, more leverage, more capacity for retaliation than anyone we've ever gone up against. Which is exactly why," Vittorio said, "we do not wait for him to reveal himself on his own terms. We flush him out on ours, before that wedding, and we end him permanently this time. Not with a staged ambush that leaves room for doubt, but with a bullet witnessed by enough people that there's no possibility of a second resurrection." He crossed to a locked cabinet in the corner of his office, retrieving a folder Matteo had never seen before, sliding it across the desk with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been quietly preparing for this contingency far longer than he had let on. "I've had Bassano watching the periphery of Isabella's life for months," Vittorio said, quietly, in case exactly this scenario ever came to pass. Matteo did not know, could not have known in that moment, that Emilio Bassano had, 3 nights earlier, sat across a steel table from the very ghost his father was hunting, and had already made his choice about which side of this coming war he intended to survive. "Increase the security around the wedding," Vittorio continued. "Tell Isabella it's for her protection, that we've received threats from rival families jealous of our union. She'll believe it. The world of men like us has taught women like her to expect danger as a constant companion. And in the meantime, I want eyes on every person who comes near her between now and the ceremony. If De Luca is stupid enough or in love enough to reveal himself before that wedding, I want to be the one holding the gun when he does." Matteo looked at his father for a long moment, something uneasy moving behind his own carefully cultivated confidence. The first flicker of doubt he had allowed himself since deciding that marrying Isabella Romano was simply a matter of patient acquisition, like any other asset his family had ever claimed. "And if he doesn't reveal himself," Matteo said quietly, "if we go through with the wedding and he's out there somewhere, watching, and does nothing. Vittorio's smile held no warmth at all. Then you'll have married the one woman in New York capable of making even a dead man jealous, and I'll finally have absolute proof that the De Luca Empire is exactly as extinct as we've told everyone it is. Either way, son, we win. The only question is how much blood the winning requires. Isabella noticed the increase in security the same week she received the lily. 2 additional men stationed outside her apartment building under the guise of wedding security. A driver who now insisted on accompanying her to every appointment, a subtle but unmistakable narrowing of her freedom that felt less like protection and more like surveillance.
"It's just a precaution," Matteo told her when she raised the issue over a dinner she had barely touched. "There are families jealous of our union. My father wants to make sure nothing happens to you before the wedding." "Or after it," Isabella said quietly, and Matteo's jaw tightened in a way that told her the comment had landed closer to some truth than she'd intended. She did not know, could not have known, that the driver assigned to her that week, a quiet, watchful man named Tommaso, had been given explicit instructions to report anyone who approached her, anyone unfamiliar who lingered too long near her building, any pattern that might suggest a ghost circling closer than the Conti family was comfortable with. She did not visit the grave that Sunday, for the first time in 2 years. Not by choice, but because Tommaso insisted on accompanying her. And the thought of speaking to Alessandro's headstone, with an armed stranger standing 10 feet away, listening to every word, felt like a violation she could not bring herself to endure. Instead, she asked to be driven to her father's restaurant, and spent the evening in its small kitchen, cooking alongside him, in a silence that had grown comfortable over 30 years of shared grief, for a woman neither of them had ever fully stopped mourning. "You look tired," her father said, watching her chop vegetables with the mechanical precision of a woman whose body was performing tasks her mind had checked out from. "I'm getting married in 4 weeks," Isabella said. "I'm allowed to be tired." Salvatore Romano set down his own knife, studying his daughter's face with the particular attentiveness of a father who had spent 2 years watching her disappear a little more each month, first into grief and now into something that looked, to his eyes, like resignation. "This is not what I wanted for you, Bella." "I know, Papa. If there were any other way—" "There isn't." Isabella set down her own knife, meeting her father's eyes. "And I've made my peace with it. I'm going to marry Matteo Conti, and I'm going to keep this restaurant open. And someday, maybe, I'll find a way to feel something for him that isn't just gratitude for not being cruel. It won't be love, but it will be enough to survive." She did not tell him about the lily, or the note, or the 4 words that had kept her awake for 3 nights running, whispering through her mind on an endless loop that felt increasingly less like grief-induced fantasy and more like a possibility she was too afraid to name. "Wait for me, please." She had told herself over and over that it was cruel, that someone, perhaps someone in Alessandro's old organization, perhaps even someone in Matteo's, was playing a psychological game with a grieving woman's fragile hope, and that entertaining even a moment's belief that Alessandro De Luca might somehow, impossibly be alive, was a betrayal of the 2 years of grief she had built her entire identity around. But some part of her, the part that had knelt at a grave every Sunday for 2 years, the part that had never quite been able to accept his death the way the rest of the world had begun, against every rational instinct, to hope. That night,
Driving home from her father's restaurant with Tommaso silent behind the wheel, Isabella caught sight of a black sedan idling on a side street 2 blocks from her apartment, its windows tinted too dark to see inside, and something in her chest tightened with a recognition she could not name. "Tommaso," she said, "can you slow down? I think I dropped something." She had dropped nothing. She wanted only an excuse to look longer, to see if the sedan moved, to catch some glimpse of whoever sat behind its darkened glass.
Tommaso, suspicious but obedient, slowed the car, and Isabella turned in her seat to watch the sedan through the rear window. It pulled away before she could see anything at all. No license plate visible, no shape distinguishable through the tinted glass, nothing but the impression, fleeting and impossible to prove, that whoever had been inside had been watching her too. "Everything all right, Miss Romano?" Tommaso asked, his eyes finding hers in the rear-view mirror. "Fine," Isabella said, though her heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a hope she did not yet trust herself to name aloud. "I just thought I saw something." She did not report the sedan to Matteo or to his father's security detail, though she suspected, correctly, that reporting it would only tighten the net further, would only give Vittorio Conti more reason to believe his suspicions were correct. Instead, she carried the sighting home with her like a secret, turning it over in her mind long after she'd gone to bed, staring at the ceiling of her dark apartment and whispering to no one, to the empty room, to whatever fragile thread of hope had begun, impossibly, to unspool inside her chest. "If it's you," she whispered, "if there's any chance at all that it's you, please, please don't wait too long. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to believing in ghosts." The recording Emilio Bassano provided arrived at the dark penthouse in Long Island City on a Thursday evening, delivered by Salvatore Greco himself with the particular gravity of a man handing over a weapon capable of ending a war. Alessandro listened to it 3 times before he spoke. The audio was imperfect, recorded on a hidden device Bassano had carried into a meeting 18 months earlier, the quality tinny and occasionally muffled by ambient noise, but the content was unmistakable. Vittorio Conti's voice, discussing logistics with a man identified only as the chemist, outlining a timeline for introducing a slow-acting compound into Marco Silvestri's drink, discussing the West Side Highway route with the specific, chilling precision of a man who had planned murder the way other men planned business mergers. "This is enough," Dante said quietly when the recording finished for the 3rd time. "Combined with the financial records tracing the chemist's payment back to Conti accounts, combined with Bassano's testimony, this is enough to bring down Vittorio Conti's entire organization from within. His own capos will turn on him the moment this reaches them. No honor code survives evidence this direct." "It's enough to destroy him," Alessandro agreed. "But it isn't enough to stop a wedding 4 weeks from now, unless we move faster than Vittorio can consolidate." "There's a way," Salvatore said, and something in his voice made both Alessandro and Dante look up sharply, because Salvatore Greco, in 2 years of careful, methodical planning, had never once suggested moving faster than caution allowed. "Bassano tells me Vittorio's suspicious already. The lily, the note. Matteo reported it to his father, and Vittorio's tightened security around Isabella specifically, because he suspects you might not be as dead as advertised." Alessandro's expression darkened. "That was a risk I took knowingly. I don't regret it." "I'm not saying you should," Salvatore said. "I'm saying the timeline has changed, whether we like it or not.
Vittorio isn't a fool. If he suspects you're alive, he's not going to wait passively for confirmation. He's going to try to draw you out on his terms before the wedding, so he can eliminate the threat permanently, rather than risk you disrupting the ceremony. Meaning he'll use her as bait, Alessandro said, the words coming out flat, dangerous, a stillness in his voice that both men in the room recognized as the precursor to violence.
Meaning, Salvatore said carefully, that the wedding itself may become the trap, whether Vittorio intends it consciously or not. Every couple, every ally, every enemy who might have information about your survival, Vittorio will want them all in one room, watching closely, ready to identify and eliminate you the moment you show yourself. Then that's exactly where I need to be, Alessandro said. Boss, I have spent 2 years building patience I do not naturally possess, Alessandro said, rising from the table, crossing to the window that looked out over a city he had watched from the shadows for far too long. I have watched her grieve me through 2 winters. I have watched her prepare to marry a man who bought her like property because I was too careful, too slow, too committed to a strategy that prioritized my empire over her heart. I am done being careful, Dante. I am done being patient. If Vittorio Conti wants to use his son's wedding as the stage for a final confrontation, then I will give him exactly that. But on my terms, with my evidence, in front of every witness whose loyalty determines whether his empire survives the exposure. That's a hell of a gamble, Dante said quietly. Everything about loving her has been a gamble, Alessandro said, and for a moment the mask of the ruthless boss slipped entirely, revealing underneath it the face of a man who had spent 2 years in exile for a single, desperate hope. I gambled that faking my death would save her from a war she didn't choose. I gambled that 2 years would be enough to end a conspiracy that's turned out to run deeper than I ever imagined. And now I'm gambling that walking into that wedding, exposing myself in front of Vittorio Conti and everyone loyal to him, is a risk worth taking, because the alternative is watching her marry a stranger while I hide in the shadows, congratulating myself on my caution. He turned from the window, and his eyes, when they met Dante's and Salvatore's, carried a certainty that neither man had seen in 2 years of careful, grief-laden planning. "We have 4 weeks," he said. "I want the evidence against Vittorio Conti airtight. I want every capo who might turn against him identified and quietly informed of what we know, so that when I walk into that church, his own organization is already fracturing beneath him. I want Bassano protected, and I want a plan for extracting Isabella the moment things go wrong, because they will go wrong, and I refuse to have her caught in the crossfire of a war I started to protect her from in the first place." "And if Vittorio moves before the wedding?" Salvatore asked. "If he decides waiting 4 weeks is too great a risk?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. "Then we move faster, whatever it takes. I did not survive 2 years in the shadows, watching the woman I love build me a grave and mourn me every Sunday, to lose her now to a man's ambition and a father's cowardice. Vittorio Conti murdered Marco Silvestri to steal my empire. He will not also steal my future." 2 weeks before the wedding, Vittorio Conti's security net closed tighter, and the black sedan Isabella had glimpsed on that quiet side street was found, empty, abandoned, wiped clean of prints, parked 3 blocks from Alessandro's Long Island City penthouse, discovered by one of Conti's men who had, against every instruction, followed a hunch instead of a direct order. They found the car,
Nico reported, arriving at the penthouse breathless, having driven the last mile at a speed that would have earned him a dozen tickets if any traffic camera in the city still had jurisdiction over men who officially did not exist. Conti's people ID'd the plates as one of ours, untraceable to you directly, but close enough to the network we've been building that it's confirmation something's operating out here that shouldn't be.
Alessandro's expression did not change, though something in the set of his shoulders tightened. Do they know it was me specifically who used that car? Not yet, but Vittorio's not stupid, and he's not going to need much more before he connects the dots. The lily, the note, a sedan seen near Isabella's apartment on multiple occasions. He's building a case, boss. The same way we've been building one against him. And he's got fewer scruples about acting on incomplete evidence than we do. Meaning? Meaning, I think he's going to move against her before the wedding, Nico said. Not to hurt her, not yet. Not while he still needs the marriage to legitimize his son's claim to your old territory. But I think he's going to isolate her further. Cut off any remaining chance you have of reaching her before the ceremony, and force the wedding forward faster than planned, to close the window before you can act. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a stillness that Nico recognized from years of service, the particular calm of a man who had already decided on a course of action and was simply working out its final details. Get Dante, he said. I want the case against Vittorio finalized within the week. Every capo who's shown even a flicker of doubt about his leadership, I want approached quietly, individually, and shown enough of our evidence to plant real uncertainty about whether they want to go down with a man who murdered his way into power on a lie.
That's aggressive, even for us.
We don't have the luxury of slow anymore, Alessandro said. Vittorio's accelerating his own timeline. We accelerate ours. I want this finished before that wedding, Nico. Not because timing is elegant, but because I refuse to let her stand at an altar even 1 hour longer than absolutely necessary. That night, Isabella lay awake in her apartment, staring at a ceiling she had memorized every crack of over 2 years of sleepless grief, and found herself, for the first time since the funeral, praying. Not to any god she was entirely sure she believed in, but to the possibility, fragile and impossible to release, that the 4 words in that note had meant exactly what they said. Wait for me. Please. She had told no one about the note. Not her father, who would have worried himself sick with hope he could not afford to nurse. Not Matteo, who would have tightened his grip further, treating any lingering attachment to a dead man as a threat to be managed, rather than a grief to be honoured. She had told only the grave, on the last Sunday she'd been permitted to visit before Tommaso's constant presence made the ritual impossible, whispering the words of the note into the cold granite, as if the stone itself might carry them somewhere the man they were meant for could hear. She did not know that 2 miles away, in a dark penthouse overlooking a city that had no idea a war was reaching its final hours, a man had listened to a recording of exactly that visit, provided by an operative who had, at great risk, planted a small recording device near the grave weeks earlier, capturing every word Isabella had ever spoken to a headstone she believed held nothing but grief. Alessandro had listened to that recording more times than he could count. He had memorized the particular cadence of her voice when it broke, the way she laughed brokenly at her own hope before crushing it back down out of self-protection.
The way she had, on that last Sunday, pressed her lips against the top of the granite headstone and whispered words that had nearly brought him to his knees in the dark privacy of his own penthouse, alone, unable to go to her, unable to do anything but listen and grieve and wait. "If it's you," her recorded voice said, tinny and small through the speaker, "if there's any chance at all that it's you, please, please don't wait too long. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to believing in ghosts." He had not waited long after that. He had moved every resource he possessed, called in every favour. 2 years of careful planning had accumulated, pushed Dante and Salvatore and Nico past the limits of caution they had all, once, agreed were necessary for survival. Because survival, he had come to understand, was not the same thing as living. And he had spent 2 years surviving in the shadows, while the woman he loved slowly stopped living in the light. "One more week," he told the empty penthouse, the recorded sound of her voice still echoing in the silence after it finished playing. "One more week, Isabella, and then I keep every promise I ever made you, even the ones I never got the chance to say out loud." The rehearsal dinner, held in a private room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants 3 days before the wedding, was the closest thing to a public unveiling of Conti family power that Vittorio had ever staged. 200 guests, a guest list that read like a roster of everyone who mattered in the world Alessandro De Luca had once ruled. Capos and consiglieres and old family allies, all gathered under one roof to witness the symbolic completion of a conquest 2 years in the making. Isabella stood beside Matteo in a green silk dress his mother had selected, smiling the careful, practiced smile she had perfected over months of engagement events, and felt throughout the entire evening the particular vertigo of a woman watching her own life from a great and unbridgeable distance. She did not know that among the 200 guests seated at a table reserved for a supplier the Conti family used for imported wine, a supplier who did not exist, whose invitation had been forged by Salvatore Greco 3 weeks earlier with a precision that would have impressed even Vittorio's own security team, sat a man with greying temples and a face subtly altered by 2 years of stress and careful disguise, watching her from across a crowded room for the first time since her own wedding rehearsal for a marriage to someone else. Alessandro had debated for days whether attending in disguise was reckless beyond justification. Salvatore had argued against it fiercely. Dante had argued for it, understanding, better than Salvatore, the particular desperation that had driven his oldest friend for 2 years. "I need to see her," Alessandro had said, the argument that had ultimately won. "Not through a photograph, not through a recording. I need to see her face, in the same room as me, before I decide exactly how this ends. I need to know what I'm fighting for isn't a memory I've built up in 2 years of absence, but a woman who's still there, underneath whatever this engagement has done to her." He watched her now, across a room glittering with the particular excess of men who had built fortunes on violence and wanted the world to forget it, and something in his chest, already raw from 2 years of careful restraint, threatened to tear open entirely. She had lost weight, as the reports had said. Her face carried a thinness that spoke of grief carried too long without adequate rest. But it was her eyes that undid him, The particular flatness in them, the absence of the light that had once made her laugh at his driest jokes, that had once looked at him across crowded rooms exactly like this one, with an intensity that had made him feel for the first time in his adult life entirely and helplessly known. She was performing happiness for 200 guests who had no idea they were watching a woman slowly disappearing in real time. Matteo, beside her, raised a glass for a toast, his voice carrying easily across the room with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own entitlement to whatever he wanted. "To Isabella," he said, "who has brought a light to this family that we did not know we were missing." Alessandro's hand around his own wine glass tightened until his knuckles went white. He watched her raise her own glass in response, watched the particular effort it took her to arrange her face into something resembling gratitude, and understood, in that moment, with a clarity sharper than any strategic calculation, that he could not survive 4 more days of this. Could not survive watching her stand at an altar in 3 days' time, promising herself to a man who saw her as a conquest rather than a person, while he sat in the shadows, congratulating himself on the patience of his careful plan. He rose from the table before the toast finished, moving through the crowd with the particular economy of motion he had spent 30 years cultivating, and found himself, for one suspended, impossible moment, close enough to Isabella that he could have reached out and touched the sleeve of her dress. She did not recognize him. 2 years. A beard he had grown and shaved and grown again for the occasion, grey at his temples that had not been there before. The particular stoop of shoulders belonging to a man 20 years his senior. The disguise held, even at close range, even as her eyes passed briefly, incuriously, across his face, on their way to some more distant point in the crowded room. But something happened in that half-second of proximity that no disguise could entirely account for. Isabella's expression flickered, some small, involuntary catch of breath, a hand that rose briefly, unconsciously, toward her chest, as if responding to a sensation she could not name. She looked back toward him, searching, but he had already moved past, already dissolved back into the crowd of 200 guests who had no idea a ghost had just walked among them. "Are you all right?" Matteo asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "Fine," Isabella said, though her voice carried a tremor she could not fully suppress. "I just felt, I don't know, like someone was watching me." "Everyone's watching you tonight," Matteo said, mistaking her unease for the natural nervousness of a bride 3 days from her wedding, sliding a possessive hand to the small of her back. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room." Isabella did not correct him. She simply turned back toward the crowd, her eyes scanning faces she did not recognize, searching for something, someone she could not have named even if pressed, while 3 tables away, a man who had once promised her a future disappeared through a service entrance before his disguise could be tested any further, his heart hammering with a fear he had not felt in 2 years of careful, calculated planning. The fear that she might have recognized him, and the equal opposite fear that she hadn't. Isabella did not sleep the night after the rehearsal dinner. She lay in her bed, replaying the strange, electric moment of feeling watched, trying to identify what had triggered it, unable to shake the sensation that some part of her body had recognized something her conscious mind could not access. She thought about it the way she thought about restoring old paintings, the particular skill of recognizing, beneath layers of grime and overpainting, and time's slow damage, the original brushstroke underneath, the artist's true hand hidden beneath everything that had accumulated on top of it. Her body, she realized, had done something similar that night. Recognized a shape, a presence, a quality of attention that felt like something from before her grief had reshaped her entire understanding of what love could look like. She rose before dawn and dressed quietly, careful not to wake the house. She had moved back into her father's home above the restaurant for the final days before her wedding, a small mercy Contessa Conti had permitted, understanding, perhaps, that even brides being purchased needed some illusion of family comfort in their final days of freedom. She did not tell her father where she was going. She did not tell Tommaso, who had been given the days before the wedding off, under the assumption that a bride 3 days from her ceremony required no additional security while safely sequestered in her family home. She simply took her father's old car, the one he'd driven for 15 years and refused to replace, and drove north, out of Brooklyn, across the bridge, up along the river, until the small, half-forgotten cemetery in Riverdale came into view, grey in the early morning light. She had not been permitted to visit in 2 weeks. The absence had felt, each Sunday, like a small death of its own. One more thing Matteo's family had quietly taken from her. One more freedom surrendered in the slow, incremental process of becoming someone's wife instead of someone's own person. She knelt at the grave in the grey dawn light, the granite cold beneath her palms, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply breathing, simply existing in the one place in her entire life that still felt like it belonged to her and no one else. "I'm getting married in 3 days," she said finally, "and I don't know how to do this without you knowing. I don't know how to walk down an aisle toward a man I don't love, while some part of me is still down here, kneeling in the mud, waiting for you to answer me back." She laughed, the same broken sound she always made at this point in her Sunday visits, the sound of a woman who had learned that grief, given enough time, developed its own dark humour. "Last night I thought I felt you. Isn't that strange? 2 years, and I've never once felt anything except absence when I come here, and last night, in a room full of 200 strangers, I thought, for one impossible second, that you were standing right beside me." She did not know that he was, in fact, standing 40 yards away, hidden behind the same ancient oak that had sheltered him through 2 years of Sunday visits, watching her kneel in the dawn light with an ache in his chest that had finally, after 2 years of careful restraint, begun to outweigh every strategic calculation he had built his entire plan around. Dante had warned him against coming. Salvatore had warned him more forcefully still, reminding him that Vittorio's security net had tightened, that Tommaso's absence today did not mean the grave was unwatched, that every risk he took in these final days before the wedding threatened not just his own careful plan, but Isabella's very life. Alessandro had come anyway, because some part of him had understood, watching her flicker of recognition at the rehearsal dinner, that he was running out of time to choose the careful, patient path, that whatever was going to happen between them, whatever confrontation was coming with Vittorio Conti and his son, needed her to know the truth before it happened, not after, not as a surprise sprung on her at the worst possible moment, but as a truth she could carry into whatever chaos was about to unfold, with her eyes open and her heart prepared. He took one step forward, out from behind the ancient oak, and stopped himself. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not until the evidence is airtight. Not until Vittorio's own capos have turned. Not until I can walk toward her, not as a fugitive hiding from his enemies, but as a man capable of protecting her from whatever comes next. He watched her rise from her knees, brush the mud from her jeans, and turn to leave, and something in her posture, a fractional straightening of her shoulders, a lift to her chin that had not been there when she'd arrived, suggested that even this brief visit, even this small theft of a forbidden Sunday, had given her something she badly needed. She paused at the edge of the small cemetery, looking back toward the grave, toward the ancient oak, toward the river beyond it, catching the first full light of dawn. And for a moment her eyes swept across the exact spot where Alessandro stood, hidden, but not, he suspected, hidden quite well enough. 3 days, she said quietly, to no one, to the wind, to the ghost she had never quite stopped believing might be listening. 3 days. And then I keep my promise, whatever it costs me. I loved you. I will always have loved you, even if I have to spend the rest of my life pretending I love someone else instead. She turned and walked back toward her father's old car, and Alessandro stood beneath the ancient oak for a long time after she'd gone, his hands pressed flat against the rough bark, his forehead bowed, fighting a battle inside himself that no amount of careful planning had prepared him for. The battle between the strategist who understood the value of patience and the man who understood that some things, some people, were worth more than any strategy could account for. 3 days, he said finally, echoing her words back into the empty morning air. 3 days, Isabella, and then I come for you, whatever it costs me. The final piece of evidence against Vittorio Conti arrived on the morning of the day before the wedding, delivered by a man neither Alessandro nor Dante had expected to hear from again. Renata Salvi, Alessandro's father's former consigliere, the woman who had spent 6 years nursing a grudge over her exile from the family's heroin trade, and who had, until this moment, remained the single most opaque suspect on their original list of 3. She arrived at the Long Island City penthouse, alone, unarmed, escorted by Salvatore Greco, with the particular wariness of a man who did not entirely trust a woman he had spent 2 years investigating as a possible traitor. "I know what you think of me," Renata said, standing in the dark penthouse with the composed dignity of a woman who had survived 4 decades in a business that chewed up and discarded most people who resembled her. "I know I was on your list of suspects. I won't insult either of us by pretending I wasn't angry when you pushed the family away from the heroin trade, Alessandro. I built half my career on that business. You ended it because it offended your sense of legacy, and I never forgave you for the income I lost." "But you didn't order the ambush," Alessandro said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Renata said. "Whatever you think of me, I am not a woman who murders children over old grudges, and Marco Silvestri was, in every way that mattered, one of yours. I watched you raise that boy up from nothing, poisoning him to get to you. That's Conti's brutality, not mine. My revenge, if I ever wanted it, would have looked like humiliation, not murder. I would have wanted you alive to watch me take everything you built." "Then why are you here?" Renata's expression shifted, something more complicated than grudge or ambition moving behind her carefully composed features. "Because I've spent 6 years angry at you for taking away my business, and 2 years watching Vittorio Conti build an empire on the corpse of a man I actually respected, whatever our disagreements. And I have realized, slowly, the way these things always happen too slowly, that being right about my grievance against you does not mean I want to live in the world Vittorio Conti is building in your absence. She produced a folder from her bag, sliding it across the table, with the same deliberate care Salvatore had once used to deliver Bassano's recording. "Bank records," she said, "from an account I've watched for 6 years, ever since I lost my position and started keeping tabs on everyone who benefited from my fall. Vittorio Conti has been paying a Justice Department contact for 2 years. Someone inside the very investigation that supposedly brought down your empire, Alessandro. He's been feeding false information to federal prosecutors, manufacturing evidence against rival families, using the government's own machinery to eliminate competition, while dressing it up as law enforcement doing its job." Dante, standing beside Alessandro, went very still. That's not just organized crime. That's obstruction of federal justice. That's enough to bring down every layer of protection Vittorio's built for himself. It's enough, Renata agreed, combined with whatever else you've gathered, to ensure that when Vittorio Conti falls tomorrow, he does not fall quietly into some rival family's hands, ready to rebuild in exile. He falls into federal custody, publicly, undeniably, in front of every witness whose loyalty he's spent 2 years buying. There is no recovering from an exposure like that. Not for him, not for his son. Alessandro studied the folder for a long moment, understanding, with the particular clarity that came from 2 years of careful, patient assembly, that the pieces of his revenge, Bassano's recording, the financial trail Dante had traced for months, and now Renata's federal corruption evidence, had finally, completely assembled themselves into a weapon capable of ending not just Vittorio Conti's ambitions, but his entire empire in one single, irreversible stroke. "Why bring this to me now?" he asked, "instead of using it yourself? You could have brought Vittorio down months ago, taken his territory for yourself." Renata's smile was thin, humourless, the expression of a woman who had spent 4 decades learning the true cost of power in a world that rarely rewarded honesty about it. "Because taking his territory for myself would make me exactly the kind of ruler he is, someone willing to use any tool, however corrupt, to acquire power I haven't earned honestly. I want him gone, Alessandro. I don't particularly want to replace him. I would much rather see you rebuild what he stole from you, because whatever our disagreements, you were at least a man who believed the old codes meant something. Vittorio Conti believes in nothing except his own ambition, and I am done living in a world where men like that inherit everything simply because they're willing to be more ruthless than everyone around them." "And the wedding tomorrow?" "The wedding tomorrow," Renata said, "is the perfect stage for exactly the reckoning you've spent 2 years building toward. Every capo who matters will be in that church. Every witness whose testimony could end Vittorio's career will be sitting in those pews, watching. If you're going to reveal yourself, Alessandro, and I assume from the look on your face that you've already decided you are, there is no better moment than tomorrow, in front of every person whose loyalty determines whether Vittorio Conti survives the exposure of his own crimes." Alessandro closed the folder, his hands steady despite the storm building beneath his careful, controlled exterior. "Tomorrow," he said, "I go to that wedding. Not to stop it quietly, not to whisk her away in the shadows the way I've spent 2 years watching from a distance. Tomorrow, I end this the way it should have ended from the beginning, in the light, in front of everyone, with the truth finally strong enough to survive its own revelation. "And Isabella?" Dante asked quietly. Alessandro's eyes, when they met his oldest friends, carried a certainty 2 years in the making, forged in grief and patience and a love that had survived every strategic calculation designed to contain it. "Isabella," he said, "gets the truth before she says a single word of vows to another man. Whatever it costs me, whatever risk it requires, I have made her wait long enough." Isabella woke before dawn on the morning of her wedding in the same childhood bedroom above her father's restaurant where she had slept as a girl, and lay for a long time staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of Bensonhurst waking up around her. A delivery truck idling on the street below, a neighbour's radio playing faintly through thin walls, the ordinary music of a world that had no idea today was the day she surrendered whatever remained of her own future. The wedding gown hung in her closet, white and enormous, and to her eyes in the grey dawn light, faintly obscene. A costume for a performance she had never auditioned for, and could not, now, find any way to escape. She dressed quietly, in jeans and an old sweater, and slipped out of the house before her father woke, before Contessa Conti's assistants arrived to begin the elaborate process of transforming her into a bride, before Tommaso resumed his post outside her door for the final hours of her unmarried life. She drove north one last time, the familiar roads unspooling beneath her father's old car with the particular clarity of a route driven so many times the body no longer needed the mind's full attention, and arrived at the small cemetery in Riverdale just as the sun cleared the horizon, throwing long gold light across the river below. She had brought white lilies as always, though this bouquet was larger than her usual offering. An armful of them, extravagant and fragrant, purchased the night before with money she could not really spare, because some part of her had understood, driving to the flower shop in the dark, that this visit needed to be different from all the ones that had come before it. This was not simply another Sunday. This was goodbye. She knelt at the grave, arranging the lilies with the careful precision she brought to every act of restoration, every attempt to make something broken look, for a moment, whole again. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, and her voice, for the first time in 2 years of these visits, did not break on the words, had instead the flat, exhausted calm of a woman who had cried every possible tear she had to give, and had, somewhere in the sleepless nights of the past week, arrived at a kind of peace with her own grief, however unwanted that peace was. "I'm getting married in 4 hours," she continued. "To a man I don't love, to save a restaurant that means everything to my father and nothing really to me anymore, not since Mama died. I used to think I understood what sacrifice meant. I don't think I understood anything until you taught me. And then you left. And now I'm sacrificing again, except this time there's no one teaching me anything except how to survive a life I never wanted." She pressed her palm flat against the cold granite, the way she had 1,000 times before, the gesture as natural to her now as breathing. "I kept my promise," she whispered. 2 years, and I never once stopped loving you. I never let anyone else close enough to matter. Matteo will have my hand today, and my name, and whatever future I have left to give. But he will never have this." Her hand pressed harder against the stone. "This belongs to you. It will always belong to you. I loved only you. The wind moved through the bare branches of the ancient oak, carrying the smell of the river, the particular cold clarity of a November morning, and for a long moment there was no sound at all, except her own breathing and the distant call of a bird somewhere over the water. Then a voice spoke behind her, low and familiar, in a way that made every cell in her body go still before her mind had even finished processing the words.
"Then don't marry him." Isabella did not move for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that felt to her like the entire span of her grief compressed into a single suspended moment, her heart seizing so completely she genuinely believed for that brief eternity that she had finally, after 2 years of careful discipline, lost her mind entirely. She turned around in disbelief. He stood a few steps away, close enough that she could see every detail her memory had tried for 2 years to preserve exactly. The sharp planes of his face, though thinner now, weathered by something she recognized as suffering. The dark eyes that had once made her feel, across a crowded balcony at a charity gala, entirely and helplessly seen. The particular stillness of a man who had spent his whole life learning to hold violence and tenderness in the same body, without either one destroying the other. Grey had crept into his temples that had not been there before. A scar, thin and pale, traced along his jaw that she did not recognize. But it was him. It was unmistakably, impossibly, undeniably him. The man she had buried, the man she had cried for through 2 winters, the man she had never, not for a single day, stopped loving. Standing only a few steps away, alive, breathing, watching her, with an expression that carried 2 years of grief and longing compressed into a single, unbearable look. "Alessandro," she said, and his name came out of her not as a question, but as a prayer, the sound of it breaking something open in her chest that she had spent 2 years carefully, deliberately sealing shut. "You're alive," he finished quietly, when she could not make herself say the word. "I'm alive, Isabella. I have been alive this entire time." She did not faint, though for a moment the world tilted so violently around her that she reached out instinctively for the headstone behind her, the same cold granite she had knelt before for 2 years, mourning a man who now stood close enough to touch, watching her with an expression that carried more raw feeling than she had ever seen on his carefully composed face, even in the 18 months she had known him before his death. "You're alive," she repeated, the words still not fully processing, her mind struggling to reconcile 2 years of grief against the impossible fact standing in front of her. "You let me bury you. You let me build this grave. You let me kneel here every Sunday for 2 years, talking to a headstone, believing—" Her voice broke entirely. The careful composure she had built over 2 years of performing strength shattering all at once. "You let me think you were dead." "Yes," Alessandro said, and he did not flinch from the accusation, did not offer excuses or softened explanations, simply stood before her and accepted the full weight of what he had done. "I made that choice. I would make it again, though God knows it's cost me more than I can ever make you understand." "Why?" The word came out of her as something between a sob and a demand, 2 years of unexpressed grief and rage finally finding an outlet.
Why would you do that to me? Do you have any idea what it did to me, Alessandro? Do you have any idea what it's like to grieve someone for 2 years? To build a life around loving a dead man and then find out he's been alive this entire time, watching. She stopped, something in his expression confirming a suspicion that had just formed. You've been watching me, haven't you, this whole time? Yes, he said again, and the admission seemed to cost him something visible. A flinch of genuine pain crossing his face. Not every day. Not enough to be careless, but yes, Isabella. I have watched you kneel at this grave more times than I can count. I have watched you grieve me in every season for 2 years. And every single time it has felt like dying all over again. Knowing I could not cross the distance between us without putting your life in more danger than I was willing to risk.
Danger from what? From the men who tried to kill me 2 years ago, he said. From a conspiracy inside my own organization that I could not dismantle without letting the world, including you, believe I was gone. If the men who ordered the ambush on my convoy had known I survived, they would have finished the job, and they would have used you to do it. I faked my death to protect the woman I love from a war she never chose to be part of. I have spent 2 years hunting down every traitor, every conspirator, every piece of evidence needed to end this permanently, so that when I finally came back to you, I could come back as a man capable of keeping you safe, rather than one who simply dragged you back into the same danger I was trying to save you from. Isabella's hands, still pressed against the cold granite behind her, had begun to shake, not with cold, but with the particular vertigo of grief, transforming in real time into something she did not yet have language for. "You should have told me," she said. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth, instead of letting me bury you and build you a grave and cry over granite for 2 years while you watched from the shadows like some kind of—" She stopped, searching for a word cruel enough to match her hurt, and finding none adequate. Like some kind of ghost who couldn't be bothered to actually come back to life. "I know," he said quietly. "I have thought every single day for 2 years about whether I made the right choice. I have watched you lose weight, lose sleep, lose whatever light used to live behind your eyes, and I have hated myself for every single hour that passed without me telling you the truth. But I made a promise to myself, Isabella, the day I watched you kneel in the rain at my funeral. A promise that whatever it cost me, I would not put your life at greater risk by revealing myself before I was certain I could actually protect you. I chose your safety over your peace of mind. I don't regret protecting you, but I will spend the rest of my life regretting what that protection cost you." She was crying now, fully, the careful composure of 2 years of grief finally breaking entirely, though whether from relief or fury or some impossible combination of both, she could not have said. "I'm getting married in 4 hours," she said, the words coming out as something between a warning and a plea. "To a man whose family may have murdered you or tried to. What am I supposed to do with this, Alessandro? What am I supposed to do with 2 years of grief and a wedding dress hanging in my father's closet, and a man standing in front of me who I buried, who I mourned, who I have loved every single day since I thought I lost him?" Alessandro closed the remaining distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she needed to. And when she did not move away, he raised one hand and pressed it gently against the side of her face, a gesture so achingly familiar
that Isabella felt something in her chest crack open entirely. "You do exactly what your heart has already told you to do," he said quietly. "The same thing it's been telling you every Sunday for 2 years, kneeling at a grave that was never really empty of me, because I was always there, in the only way I could be, listening to every word you ever said to a headstone that held nothing but your love and my absence. Don't marry him, Isabella. Not because I'm asking you to choose me instead, though God knows I am asking exactly that, but because you have never, not for a single day of this engagement, wanted to be his." The wedding proceeded, at Alessandro's insistence, exactly as planned. Isabella walking down the aisle of a cathedral in Manhattan 2 hours later, dressed in white, her face composed into the careful blankness she had practiced for months, while 200 guests, including every capo and consigliere whose loyalty would determine the fate of the Conti Empire, watched a bride whose heart had, that very morning, been given back to a man they all believed dead. "You're certain about this?" Dante had asked one final time as they'd finalized the plan in the grey dawn light. "Letting her walk into that church, letting the ceremony proceed as far as it needs to before you reveal yourself in front of everyone. It's the only way to end this completely," Alessandro had said. "If I stop the wedding quietly, before it begins, Vittorio has time to regroup, to control the narrative, to protect himself from full exposure. But if I reveal myself at the altar, in front of every witness whose testimony matters, with Renata's evidence and Bassano's recording ready to be shared the moment I speak, there's no controlling that narrative. There's no recovering from that kind of public reckoning. And Isabella has to walk into that, not knowing exactly when you'll appear." "She knows I'm coming," Alessandro had said. "She doesn't know precisely when, but she trusts me enough now to walk toward that altar and wait. And I promise you, Dante, I will not make her wait 1 second longer than absolutely necessary." Isabella reached the altar at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, her father having walked her down the aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, and stood facing Matteo Conti, whose satisfied smile carried all the confidence of a man who believed he had successfully acquired everything he'd ever wanted. The priest began the ceremony. Isabella's hands, clasped in front of her, trembled almost imperceptibly, though her face remained composed, her eyes fixed somewhere past Matteo's shoulder, toward the back of the cathedral, waiting. "If anyone here objects to this union," the priest said, reaching the traditional pause that no modern wedding ever expected to be interrupted, "speak now, or forever hold your peace." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds before a voice, low and unmistakable, carried from the back of the cathedral, "I object." 200 heads turned as one. Alessandro De Luca walked down the centre aisle of the cathedral in a black suit, his face no longer hidden by any disguise, his identity unmistakable to every capo, every consigliere, every old ally and enemy who had once knelt to kiss his ring or plotted his downfall. The gasps that rippled through the pews carried 2 years of assumption collapsing in real time. "That's impossible," Vittorio Conti said, rising from his seat in the front pew, his face draining of colour. "You're dead. I watched them bury you." "You watched them bury an empty casket," Alessandro said, stopping at the base of the altar, his eyes moving from Vittorio to Matteo to Isabella, whose face had transformed in the span of seconds from careful composure into something raw and unguarded and disbelieving all over again, despite having known since dawn that this moment was coming. The same way you watched your own son plan to marry a woman he acquired through her father's debt, rather than through her actual consent, Vittorio. I've spent 2 years learning exactly how deep your ambitions run.
This is insane, Matteo said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence, cracking slightly under the weight of 200 watching witnesses. Whatever theatrical stunt this is, it's not a stunt, Alessandro said. He produced from inside his jacket a small device and pressed a single button, and Vittorio Conti's own voice, recorded 18 months earlier, discussing the poisoning of Marco Silvestri with chilling, methodical precision, filled the cathedral through speakers meant for wedding music. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 guests, many of them men who had spent decades in an organization built on codes of honor and loyalty, listened to their leader discuss murder with the same tone he might have used to discuss a business acquisition.
"That's fabricated," Vittorio said, though his voice had begun to shake. "Manufactured evidence, staged by a man desperate to reclaim territory he lost fair, and there's more," Alessandro said, and nodded to Dante, who stood near a side entrance with the folder Renata Salvi had provided, distributing copies to several key capos seated in the front pews, men whose loyalty, quietly cultivated over the past 6 weeks, had already begun shifting away from Vittorio Conti's leadership. Financial records showing the payment to the chemist who poisoned Marco Silvestri, evidence of federal corruption showing Vittorio Conti has spent 2 years manipulating Justice Department investigations to eliminate rival families while dressing his own crimes up as law enforcement doing its job. Every man in this cathedral who has followed Vittorio Conti's leadership for the past 2 years has been following a murderer who lied his way into power and has been actively cooperating with federal prosecutors against the very families he claims to protect. The reaction rippled through the pews like a physical wave. Capos who had followed Vittorio Conti loyally for years, exchanging glances of dawning horror, several rising from their seats entirely, putting physical distance between themselves and a man whose empire was collapsing in real time. "Federal cooperation," one of the older capos said, his voice carrying across the sudden chaos of the cathedral. "You've been feeding information to the feds? Against us?" "He's lying," Vittorio said, though his voice carried none of its earlier authority, and his eyes had begun darting toward the cathedral's exits with the particular desperation of a man realizing too late that his empire had already crumbled beneath him. "This is a fabrication, a desperate act by a man who lost everything and wants it back." "I have not lost everything," Alessandro said, and his voice, when he turned finally toward Isabella, standing frozen at the altar in her white gown, carried a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to everything that had come before it. "I have spent 2 years reclaiming exactly what matters, Vittorio, and unlike you, I never needed to murder an innocent man or manipulate federal law enforcement to do it. I simply needed the truth and the patience to gather it properly." Emilio Bassano, seated quietly among the capos in the third pew, rose to his feet, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man crossing a final line. "He's telling the truth," Bassano said. "I helped Vittorio plan the ambush that supposedly killed Alessandro De Luca. I've spent 4 months trying to find a way out of an organization built on a lie, and I am done protecting a man who murdered his way into power and then sold out the families he claimed to serve to federal prosecutors to protect his own position. The cathedral erupted into chaos, capos shouting accusations, security details reaching for weapons they had never expected to need at a wedding, guests scrambling toward exits as the fragile pretense of celebration collapsed entirely into the raw reality of a war finally reaching its public conclusion. In the center of it all, Isabella stood frozen at the altar, watching 2 years of grief and 2 hours of impossible hope collide into a single overwhelming moment. And Alessandro crossed the remaining distance between them, ignoring the chaos erupting around them, ignoring Vittorio Conti's shouted denials and Matteo's stunned, furious protests, and reached for her hands with a gentleness that belonged entirely to the man she had loved before any of this began. "I told you I would come back," he said quietly, his voice carrying beneath the chaos meant only for her. "I told you, this morning, that I would not make you wait 1 second longer than necessary. I'm here, Isabella. I am not letting you marry him. I am not letting anyone take you from me again." The weeks that followed the collapse of Vittorio Conti's empire moved with the particular speed of dominoes falling in sequence, each one striking the next, until the entire elaborate structure he had built on 2 years of lies and murder came down completely. Federal prosecutors, presented with evidence of Vittorio's own corruption within their ranks, moved against him with the swift efficiency of an institution eager to distance itself from the scandal of its own compromised investigation. Emilio Bassano's testimony, combined with the recording and financial evidence Alessandro's organization had spent months assembling, proved sufficient to convict Vittorio Conti of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice within 4 months, a swift reckoning that surprised even Alessandro, who had spent 2 years preparing for a war that had ended in the end, not with violence, but with the simple, undeniable weight of truth exposed in front of the right witnesses. Matteo Conti, stripped of his father's protection and his own credibility, fled to Italy within weeks of the wedding's collapse, disappearing into whatever remained of extended family connections there, never to trouble Isabella Romano again. The engagement was quietly annulled, the debt against her father's restaurant forgiven as part of the broader collapse of Conti family assets, and Salvatore Romano kept his small restaurant in Bensonhurst, its red-checked tablecloths and unchanged menu a small, stubborn monument to a wife's memory that no ambitious son of a rival family would ever threaten again. Renata Salvi, whose final piece of evidence had proven decisive in Vittorio Conti's downfall, negotiated a quiet peace with Alessandro's rebuilt organization. Not forgiveness, exactly, for 6 years of accumulated grudge, but a working respect between 2 people who had, in the end, chosen honesty over ambition when it mattered most. Isabella did not return to the small cemetery in Riverdale after the wedding, though she visited once more 3 weeks after Vittorio Conti's arrest, walking the familiar path to the grave that had held her grief for 2 years, standing before the granite headstone with Alessandro's hand in hers. "I think we should take it down," she said quietly, studying the stone that had witnessed 2 years of her private mourning. "It feels strange, leaving a grave here for a man who's standing right beside me. Or Alessandro said, studying the headstone with an expression she had come to recognize over the weeks since his return, the careful consideration of a man who thought deeply before speaking. We leave it exactly as it is, not as a monument to a lie, but as a reminder of what your love survived. 2 years of grief, Isabella. 2 years of believing I was gone and choosing every single Sunday to keep loving me anyway. I don't want to erase that. I want to remember what it cost you, so I never take for granted what it means to have you standing here beside me instead of kneeling alone. She considered this, her hand tightening in his. You're a strange man, Alessandro De Luca. Most people would want to forget 2 years of mourning a lie. I am not most people, he said, and something in his voice carried the particular warmth she had once fallen in love with on a balcony overlooking the East River, a lifetime and a death and a resurrection ago. And you are not most women. You built me a grave with your own hands and visited it every single Sunday for 2 years, speaking to granite as though I could hear you. I heard every word, Isabella, every single one. And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that I was worth that faith. They were married in the spring, in a small ceremony at her father's restaurant rather than a grand cathedral, red-checked tablecloths replaced for one evening with simple white linen. Salvatore Romano walking his daughter down a short aisle between kitchen and dining room, with tears he made no effort to hide, this time from joy rather than grief. Dante Marchetti stood as best man, having spent 2 years as the keeper of secrets, and now, finally, permitted to simply celebrate. Nico Falcone and Salvatore Greco stood among the small gathering of guests, men who had sacrificed their own lives for 2 years to protect a promise their boss had refused to break, watching with quiet satisfaction as that promise was, at last, fully honoured. I loved only you, Isabella said during the vows, echoing the words she had once whispered to a granite headstone, believing no one could hear her. For 2 years I loved only you, even when the whole world told me you were gone. I will keep loving only you for however many years we have left, because I have learned that some loves don't end at a grave. Some loves simply wait there, patiently, for the person they belong to come home. I watched you keep that promise, Alessandro answered, his voice carrying the particular rawness of a man who had spent 2 years learning exactly what his love had cost the woman standing before him. Every single Sunday, from a distance I hated more than I have ever hated anything in my entire life. I promise you now what I could not promise you then, that I will never again let you grieve me from a distance. Whatever comes for us, and something will always come in this life we've chosen, we will face it together, in the light, with nothing hidden between us ever again. They kissed as husband and wife in a small restaurant in Bensonhurst that smelled of garlic and tomatoes and 30 years of a mother's memory, surrounded by the handful of people who had sacrificed the most to make this moment possible. And outside, beyond the restaurant's modest windows, New York moved on around them, indifferent as it always was to the private wars and resurrections happening within its endless, glittering sprawl. But on a quiet hill overlooking the Hudson River, a small granite headstone remained, weathered now by 3 years of seasons, bearing only a first name and dates that no longer told the whole truth of the man they represented. A monument not to death, but to the particular, unbreakable faith of a woman who had loved a ghost until he came home, and a man who had loved her enough to return from the dead rather than let that faith go unanswered. Their greatest love story, as it turned out, had not ended at that grave. It had only just begun.